The ice did not crack. It screamed. Not the low groan of a frozen lake settling under its own cold weight, but a sharp, splitting shriek that tore through the winter silence of the northern wilds like a blade dragged across stone. Karen Frost heard it from 50 paces away, and her whole body stopped before her mind could catch up. She had been carrying firewood. By the time the second sound reached her, deeper, stranger, a vibration more felt than heard, pressing up through the frozen ground and into the soles of her boots. The firewood was already in the snow. The winter of this year had fallen over the frost veil like a burial shroud. In the isolated borderlands east of Eldenwick, where the Iron Reach Mountains sealed off the sky, and the northern winds came without mercy or warning, the cold did not simply bite. It consumed. It entered the walls, the sleep, the marrow. Trees here grew warped and low, their bark split by decade after decade of frost that never fully released them. The lake beyond the ridge had no name on any map Karen had ever read. The villagers of Eldenwick called it the Blackmere, when they called it anything at all. Most of them had not come this far north in years. Most of them had no reason to, and most of them preferred to forget that Karen did. She was 22 years old, and the Frost Vale had been her home for 3 of those years, ever since the pack had walked her to the border and left her there without a word. She did not think about it often. What she thought about was firewood, and rope, and the weight of the rabbit traps she checked every morning before the light fully arrived. She had inherited her father's stone cabin at the edge of the tree line after his death, and she had rebuilt what rot and neglect had ruined. Log by log, nail by nail, with no one watching and no one helping. The villagers of Eldenwick whispered that she had gone feral, wild, that she was not quite right in the way a person ought to be. Let them whisper. An Omega without a pack was, in the eyes of most wolves, nothing at all. Karen had decided, quietly and irrevocably, that most wolves were wrong. She survived by what the land offered. Trapped game, dried roots, the pelt trade twice a season with the River Road ferryman, who asked no questions she did not want to answer. She had learned to read the forest the way other women read letters. The direction of the wind, the silence of the birds, the particular quality of cold that meant a storm was still half a day away. She had learned to trust what she heard before she understood it, which was why, when the sound came a third time from the direction of the Blackmere, Karen did not stop to ask herself whether she should go. She was already moving. Before we continue, please hit the subscribe and like button and tell me which city you're tuning in from. I love to know where this story found you. Now let's dive in. The path to the lake cut downhill through knee-deep snow that the storm had packed hard as gravel. She pulled her braid over one shoulder and kept her elbows close against the cold, her breath rising in short bursts of white against the grey afternoon sky. The sound grew as she ran, not louder so much as more. A layering of voices, deep and resonant and broken with panic, rising from the frozen surface below the ridge, as if the lake itself was crying out. She crested the rise and stopped. The Blackmere was broken. A wide section of ice near the far bank had collapsed inward, leaving a jagged black wound in the white surface that churned with dark water and thrashing shapes, enormous shapes. She could see the fur first, silver and charcoal and deep grey, and then the size of them registered, and her breath left her completely. Wolves. But not wolves like any she had tracked or skinned or read about in her father's old border logs. These creatures were built beyond the scale of any natural thing. Their shoulders would have cleared her head, their paws broader than both her hands pressed flat. They fought the ice with a terrible intelligence, not scrambling blindly, but working against the current, calculating, pushing toward edges that might hold. One had already dragged itself halfway onto solid ground and lay there shaking, its amber eyes open and fixed on her, with an expression she had no name for. Not rage, not fear, recognition. Karen unslung the rope from her shoulder. She looped the end around the trunk of the nearest pine, braced both boots against a ridge of packed snow, and reached down toward the wolf on the ice's edge. It was so large, the rope barely cleared its chest. She pulled anyway, every muscle in her back screaming, her palms burning with the friction of braided hemp, her boots skidding on the frost. The wolf surged upward to meet her effort, and together, somehow, they got it onto solid ground. It lay still, heaving, breathing. Karen went back. The second wolf. The third. The fourth tangled with a fifth. Their legs locked beneath a shelf of ice, she shattered with the hatchet at her belt. The sixth was barely conscious. The seventh had blood on its muzzle that was not from any wound she could see. By the ninth rescue, her arms had gone past pain into something that felt like absence. Numb to the elbow, shaking from the shoulder, and her vision kept narrowing at the edges in a way she did not like. The 10th wolf she dragged free by the scruff, with both fists clenched in its wet fur, pulling until her knees hit the ice and the wolf collapsed beside her, chest heaving, alive. Karen straightened, or tried to. The storm had deepened around her while she worked. The light was going. She had done enough. More than enough. Any reasonable person would leave now, go back to the cabin, peel off the frozen clothes, and survive the night. She looked down through the broken ice. Something was still in the water. A shape. Vast. Barely moving. Too deep. Drifted in the dark below the surface. Larger than any of the others by a measure that made no sense. Its fur was black. Pure black. The color of a sky without stars. And from the wound across its shoulder, something thin and silver caught the last pale light of the dying afternoon. Karen's heart did something strange in her chest. She had no idea what the silver meant yet. She had no idea what any of this meant. But her hands had already found the rope. She knew she should not go into the water. Every rational part of her, the part that had survived 3 winters alone, that knew exactly how fast a human body lost function in freezing water, that understood the difference between bravery and stupidity, told her to leave. To go home. To let the dark water keep what it had already claimed. Karen looped the rope twice around her wrist and lowered herself off the ice's edge anyway. The cold hit her like a wall. Not a sensation, not a temperature, a force, slamming through her clothes and into her skin, and deeper, reaching into the muscle beneath with fingers that did not release. Her lungs contracted. She had half a breath left and used it to push forward, arms cutting through the water toward the shape she had seen from above. Beneath the surface, the world went dark and still, the sound of the storm replaced by a low, resonant pressure. She could feel the vibration of it in her teeth. She found him by the heat. That was the impossible part, the detail her mind snagged on, even in the middle of the crisis. That this wolf, half drowned and barely alive, still radiated warmth. She felt it before her hands made contact, a pulse of something dense and alive in the freezing dark, and then her fingers closed around the thick fur of his chest and she pulled. He was immovable. For one terrible second, she thought it was over, that he was already too far gone, or too heavy, or that the water had claimed enough of him that she was simply fighting a current with her bare hands. Then something shifted. A massive leg moved against the pull of the water. A great chest expanded. He was not dead yet. He was fighting, in whatever capacity remained to him, and Karen used that. Matched her own failing strength against his, braced her boots against the rocky bottom, and hauled. They broke the surface together. Karen came up gasping, her vision grayed at the edges, and immediately grabbed the rope still looped at her wrist to arrest their drift. She got his head above water first. Then, inch by impossible inch, she worked him toward the ice shelf, toward the bank, toward air. Her arms had long since passed pain. They functioned now on something below feeling, a mechanical persistence that she suspected had more to do with refusing to fail than any remaining physical capacity. The 10 wolves watched from the bank. She had expected them to disperse by now, to take the survival they had been given, and disappear into the trees the way any animal would. Instead, they had not moved. They stood in a loose arc on the shore above the broken ice, shoulder to shoulder in the howling snow, and they watched her work with a stillness that had been unsettling from the start and had only deepened as the rescue went on. No snarling, no circling, no display of the fear or aggression that every pack wolf she had ever encountered in the wild had shown in the presence of a human. Just those eyes. Amber, silver, pale grey, all of them fixed on her with an attention that was too organized to be animal. She did not have time to think about what that meant. She got the last wolf onto the bank. He collapsed the moment he cleared the ice's edge, and the impact of his body hitting the frozen ground sent a tremor she felt in her knees 10 feet away. He was enormous. She had understood that from a distance, but proximity made it staggering. He dwarfed the others the way a draft horse dwarfs a hound. His fur was black from nose to flank, thick and waterlogged, and so dark it seemed to absorb what little light the storm allowed. His head alone was the size of her torso, and the wound was worse than it had looked from below. The silver bolt was buried deep in the meat of his left shoulder, and the flesh around it had gone wrong. Not the clean red of a fresh injury, but something darker, more complex, edged in the bruised purple of a body, fighting something it could not name. Karen had seen silver poisoning once, years ago, in an old hunting journal her father had kept. She recognized the discoloration. She understood what it meant. If the bolt stayed in, he would not survive the night. She crouched beside him, breathing hard, and his eye opened. One eye, the left, still half beneath the water's surface of his own face, too weak to lift his head. But the eye that found hers was not the eye of an animal in shock. It was amber, deep-set, and completely, unambiguously aware. Not simply conscious, present. Looking at her the way a person looks at a person, with the weight of a mind behind it. Karen did not move. He did not move. Then the sound came from behind her. A sound she had not heard from any of them in the entire hour she had spent hauling them out of the freezing water. Low, trembling, stripped bare of anything resembling strength. A whine. Not one wolf. All of them. Every wolf on the bank had dropped to the snow, heads bowed, the sound coming from deep in their chests. Not grief exactly, and not anger. Something older than either. Something that lived below both. Terror. Karen turned back to the black wolf, looked at the wound, looked at the eye still fixed on hers. The others were not frightened of the hunters who had driven them onto the ice. They were not frightened of the cold, or the dark, or the water that had nearly killed them all. They were frightened of losing him, whoever he was. Whatever he was, these creatures had survived the blackmare because of her hands and her rope. And now they were begging her, without a single word, to do it again. Karen pressed her palm flat against the black wolf's chest and felt his heart. Slow, labored, furious with the effort of still beating. "I hear you," she said quietly, to all of them, to none of them. Then she reached for her knife. The knife was useless out here. Karen understood that the moment she knelt beside him in the snow and felt the wind drive a fresh wall of cold across the back of her neck. Her hands were shaking badly enough to see. The light was nearly gone. The bolt was buried at an angle she could not safely trace without proper fire, proper tools, proper stillness, none of which existed on the open bank of a frozen lake in a deepening storm. She needed the cabin. She needed to move him. She looked at the sled she had brought for firewood, sitting 20 feet up the bank where she had dropped it, and quietly calculated the problem. The black wolf outweighed her by a factor she did not want to name. The bank was a slope of packed ice. She had no help. She stood, turned toward the sled, and her boot went out from under her. The ice gave no warning. One moment she was upright. The next she was dropping, hip catching the frozen edge of the bank, body sliding fast toward the cracked water below. She grabbed for purchase and found nothing. The ice was smooth as glass, slick with the water still running off the broken surface. She felt the cold edge of the open lake rushing up toward her, and had exactly 1 second to understand what was about to happen. Something caught her arm. Not a hand, a jaw, closed with careful, deliberate precision around her forearm, the teeth not breaking skin, the grip immovable. She jerked to a halt 6 inches from the water's edge. Then she was being pulled, steadily, without panic, backward up the bank towards solid ground. And when she finally got her feet under her and turned around, a grey wolf the size of a cart horse stood beside her, jaw still loosely bracketing her arm, watching her with calm amber eyes. It released her the moment she was stable. Karen stood very still, breathing. The wolf stepped back, and turned toward the black wolf on the bank, as if it had simply done what needed doing, and had no interest in her reaction to it. Two others were already at the sled. They had no hands, and yet they were working the wooden frame with their snouts and shoulders in a way that could not be called anything except purposeful, angling it down the slope toward where the black wolf lay. A fourth positioned itself at the massive wolf's hindquarters, bracing. A fifth lowered its head to the other side. Karen stood and watched creatures that were not supposed to think demonstrate, without a word or a signal she could detect. A coordinated plan. Then she stopped watching and picked up her end of the rope. Between them, Karen and 10 wolves who should not have been able to do what they were doing. They got him onto the sled. She did not let herself think about it. She picked up the drag handles, leaned into the weight, and started moving. The walk back to the cabin was a mile through snow that the storm had deepened in the time she had spent at the lake. The wolves flanked her the entire way, 5 on each side, moving in absolute silence through the dark tree line, their bodies breaking the worst of the wind. She could hear their breathing, steady, measured. Not the panting of exhausted animals, but something controlled, deliberate, like soldiers on a march they had made before. Karen kept her eyes on the path and did not look at them. If she looked at them too long, she would have to name what they were. She had the fire roaring within minutes of getting him through the cabin door. He filled the space beside her cot, the way a fallen tree fills a clearing. Enormous, absolute, reducing everything around him to scale. She lit every candle she owned and pushed the cot aside to give herself room to work, then laid out what she had: a bone-handled knife, a set of iron probes her father had used for field dressing game, a clay pot of rendered tallow, strips of clean linen, and the dried herb bundle she kept hanging above the window. Groundwort, fireclot moss, 2 fingers of her remaining stock of salt root. Not much. Enough, maybe. She had read about silver poisoning in her father's journals once, years ago, in a passage she had not understood at the time. She understood it now. The metal did not simply wound, it worked, spreading from the entry point through the surrounding tissue in a way that ordinary iron did not. Disrupting something the body needed, that she had no language for. The only treatment was removal, followed immediately by purging the wound with heat and pressing clean growth against it to draw the remaining toxin out. Her father's words. Not a physician's, not a healer's, a hunter's. She pressed 2 fingers against the wound to trace the angle of the bolt and felt him flinch. A great, full-body shudder that moved through him like a wave. His eye found hers. She held it. "I know," she said. "I'll be quick." She was not quick. She was careful, which was slower and worse, and he bore it with a stillness that cost him enormously. She could feel the restraint in the rigid set of his massive frame, in the way his breath came through his nose in long, controlled pulls. She worked the probe around the bolt's shaft, found the angle, and drew it out in one clean motion. He made a sound that shook the candle flames. Karen packed the wound with salt root, pressed heated linen against it, and held on. When the tension finally left his body, it left all at once, a complete surrender, enormous and sudden, like a roof beam giving way. His eyes closed, his breathing deepened. She stayed where she was, hand still flat against his side, and felt his heartbeat begin to slow into something that was not emergency, something that was sleep. She sat back against the base of the cot. The fire crackled. The storm pressed against the walls and found no way in. Outside, she could hear the soft displacement of snow that meant the wolves had settled around the cabin's perimeter, not leaving, not entering. Simply present. Karen meant to stay awake. She meant to watch him through the night, to check the wound, to be ready for whatever came next. She had 100 sensible reasons to keep her eyes open. She was asleep before the last candle guttered. She did not dream, but the hand she had pressed to his side in the last moment before sleep found her. It stayed there, resting against the slow rise and fall of a creature she believed, completely and without question, to be a wolf. She did not know yet how wrong she was. She woke because the heartbeat was gone. That was what pulled her up from sleep. Not sound, but its absence. The rhythm she had fallen asleep against. Slow and enormous and stubborn with life, had stopped moving beneath her hand. The hand itself was cold. The fire had burned down to orange coals. Pale winter light pressed through the frost-edged window in thin, colorless bars. Karen opened her eyes. The cabin was silent in a way that had texture. She understood, before she understood anything else, that she was not alone. She sat up slowly. There were 10 men in her cabin. They stood. There was no other word for it. No casual arrangement that might have made sense. They stood, distributed through the small space with a precision that used every inch of it without crowding. Their backs straight, their faces forward, their eyes already on her. They were enormous, all of them. Each one taller than the doorframe would comfortably allow, broader than the chairs and the table, and the ordinary human geometry of the room suggested as possible. Their clothing was wrong, old, dark-stitched, nothing she recognized. Their faces were scarred in ways that did not come from accidents. Their eyes, every single one of them, carried the same quality she had been unable to name at the lake: intelligence, organization, weight. Karen was on her feet before she had decided to stand. She hit the back wall with her shoulder and grabbed the first thing her hand found, the iron fire poker hanging beside the hearth, and leveled it at the room with both hands, and a steadiness she did not feel anywhere inside her body. Not one of them moved. They watched her the way the wolves had watched her, with that same unnerving stillness, and the recognition of it landed in Karen's chest like ice water poured from height. Her eyes went to the cot. The bandages were hers. She knew the linen, knew the knot at the shoulder, knew the bloodstain that had soaked through on the left side where she had packed the wound. She knew all of it. She did not know the man. He was lying where the wolf had been, broad-chested, long-limbed, taking up the cot the way something too large for it always does, not quite fitting, one arm hanging off the side, the other resting across his stomach. His hair was black with streaks of silver at the temple. His jaw carried old scars. His skin was the color of winter oak, and even at rest, even wounded and horizontal and wrapped in her field dressings, he occupied the room differently than the others, like the source of something, like the reason they were all here. His eyes opened. They were amber, deep-set, long-focused, the specific shade she had seen at the bottom of the lake when she had first pressed her palm to his chest, in the dark water. They found hers immediately and did not move. He said nothing for a moment, and the silence he used was not the silence of a man gathering words. It was the silence of a man who had never needed to hurry. "Put down the poker," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, and carried through the cabin the way a struck bell carries. You felt it in surfaces. "No one here is going to harm you. There are 10 men in my house," Karen said. Her own voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "I'll decide what to put down." Something moved in his expression. Not quite a smile. Something adjacent to one, fleeting and controlled. He said. He tried to sit up. It cost him. She watched the pain cross his face in a clean, unguarded wave before he mastered it. But he got upright, one hand braced against the cot's edge, and looked at her with full attention. "My name is Nathan," he said. "Alpha King of the Northern Wilds. These men are my vanguard, my most trusted warriors." A pause. "They were, until last night, the wolves you pulled from the Blackmere." The poker was still in her hands. She became aware that she had forgotten to breathe, and corrected it. "You saved 11 lives," Nathan continued, "mine among them. I am telling you this plainly because you have earned the plainness, and because I do not intend to begin with a lie." Karen looked at the men. The men looked back at her with those scarred, knowing faces. She looked at the bandage on Nathan's shoulder, at the linen she had cut from her own stores, at the knot she recognized because her hands had made it in firelight 6 hours ago. "Werewolves," she said. It was not a question. Her mind had already completed the architecture of it, each impossible detail of the night finding its place, the intelligence she had watched and refused to name, the coordination on the bank, the way they had flanked her on the walk home like a guard formation rather than a pack. The structure had been there all along. She had simply not had the word for it until now. "Yes," Nathan said. Karen set the poker against the wall, not because she felt safe, because she needed her hands free to think, and holding a weapon against something that could not be harmed by iron felt like theater. "The lake," she said. "How did you end up under the ice?" The amber eyes held hers, and the quality of his stillness shifted, sharpened, the way a blade sharpens toward its edge. "It was not an accident," he said. "The cabin was very quiet. My pack was driven onto the Blackmere by silver hunters, armed, coordinated, and familiar enough with our patrol routes to cut off every exit." He paused. "Someone sent them. Someone who knew exactly where we would be." Karen felt the cold enter the room, though the door had not opened. "And now that you've touched this," Nathan said, "now that your hands and your sled and your fire are part of what happened last night, whoever sent them will know your name too." Karen fed the fire. It was something to do with her hands, and her hands needed something to do while Nathan spoke. She kept her back half turned toward the hearth, adding wood in pieces, and listened. He did not dress it up. She appreciated that. The Northern Wilds, he explained, was not a wilderness. It was a kingdom, ancient, hidden from human maps, governed by pack law, and enforced by the vanguard she was currently sharing a cabin with. 12 territories, thousands of lives. A seat of power that the outside world had spent 2 centuries pretending did not exist, because the alternative was acknowledging what held the borderline between the known north and what lived beyond it. Nathan held that line. His enemies, apparently, had decided they were tired of waiting for him to stop. "The Ashcroft faction," he said. The name landed flat and deliberate. "A coalition of Highland lords who want the Northern Corridor. Trade routes, mineral rights. The territory my kingdom has held for 300 years. He shifted against the cot, and she heard the restraint in his breath as the movement pulled against the wound. "They have been maneuvering for 2 seasons. The ambush at the Blackmere was not an act of war. It was meant to look like an accident. Silver bolts through your shoulder," Karen said, without turning. "Difficult to pass off as an accident. Only if someone survives to describe them." She set the fire iron down. The hunters had driven the pack onto the ice, using fire and noise, Nathan told her. Standard game-driving technique, adapted with surgical precision for werewolves specifically. The silver rounds were not conventional ammunition. They were custom work, expensive and rare, which meant the Ashcroft faction had been planning this for long enough to commission them, which meant someone inside the Northern network had been feeding them information. Karen heard all of it and filed it carefully in the part of her mind that catalogued threats. Then she went to the window. The snow had stopped. That was the first thing she registered. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the world outside clean and white, and absolutely, perfectly legible. Every track made a mark in new snow. Every dragline, every boot print. The sled furrow from the Blackmere to her cabin door cut across the hillside like a scar, deep and unmistakable, visible from a considerable distance to anyone who knew how to read ground. Her stomach went cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. "How long have we been here?" she asked. 6 hours, perhaps 7. 6 hours in fresh fallen snow. A sled track. Boot prints overlaid with paw prints in a pattern that no ordinary person would make, and no experienced hunter would fail to notice. Karen turned from the window and crossed the room to the back wall, the one that looked like planks, and was, mostly, except for the section her father had sealed with false backing 20 years ago, and never told anyone about except her. She pressed the third board from the floor. It released. The compartment behind it was narrow and deep. She had inventoried it 6 months ago. Rope, 3 hunting blades, a crossbow with 2 full quivers of bolts, a cloth bundle of her father's border notes, and a dozen bear traps with their springs still sound. She had thought, when she found them, that she was keeping them for winter. She had not known what she was keeping them for. She began pulling things out. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Your father was a hunter," he said. "Not a question. He hunted for high houses before the political shift ruined his name." She set the crossbow against the wall and checked the drawer. Solid. He knew the frost veil better than anyone alive. He taught me what he knew, because there was no one else to teach. She glanced back. "I know every trail within 4 miles of this cabin, every hollow, every ridgeline, Every choke point where a group moving in formation would have to slow down. Nathan studied her from the cot with those amber eyes, and she saw it. The recalibration. The quiet, specific revision of whatever he had assumed about her when he first opened his eyes and found an Omega standing over him with a fire poker. She did not need him to say it. She had spent 3 years not needing anyone to say anything. She loaded the crossbow and moved back toward the window. The tree line sat 100 yards from the cabin wall, dark against the white, the pines dense enough to cover movement if someone knew to stay inside them. She looked for a long moment. Then she saw it. A shadow that had not been there 10 minutes ago. Then a second one, slightly east. Still, patient, already watching. Karen stepped back from the glass. Nathan. Her voice came out even, quiet. Exactly the way her father had taught her to speak when the ground was about to change. "They're here." "How many?" Nathan said. "2 visible, which means there are more." Karen stepped back from the window and kept her voice low. "They won't come until they've surrounded the perimeter. That gives us minutes, maybe 10. The vanguard was already on their feet." She did not know what signal Nathan gave. She saw nothing pass between them. No word or gesture. But every man in the room moved at once with the controlled economy of people who had done this before. 2 went to the door. 2 went to the far wall. The rest positioned themselves in the interior shadows, with a stillness that made them nearly invisible, which was remarkable given their size, and Karen filed that away as another thing she had no name for yet. She went to the compartment behind the false wall. "There are 6 bear traps in the bundle on the left," she said, already pulling the rope coils free. "Heavy spring, designed for game trails. I need 2 of you at the east side of the cabin, and 2 at the west. There's a natural approach corridor on each side where the tree line breaks. That's where they'll funnel." She handed rope to the nearest warrior without looking at him. "Set them shallow, covered. You'll know the spots because the snow is thinner where my father cleared the brush 10 years ago, and it never grew back." A pause, brief and weighted. "Go," Nathan said from behind her. They went. Karen pulled out the remaining traps, the 3 hunting blades, her spare bolts. She worked without looking at Nathan, because the alternative was looking at Nathan, and she needed her hands to be steady. She could feel him watching. Not the passive attention of someone at rest. Active attention. The kind that had direction and thought behind it. "Your father built this place for exactly this situation," he said. "My father built this place for a war that never came." She checked the bolt tips. All sound. He was a careful man. He died anyway, and left you his preparations. He left me what he knew. She straightened and finally turned to face him. "Which includes the fact that 10 minutes is already 8 minutes now. So if you can stand, I need you away from the window." He could stand. It cost him. She saw it in the set of his jaw, in the careful way he distributed his weight. But he was upright with his hand braced against the cabin wall, and the room had changed shape around him the moment he had. The authority that she had felt from him lying down was something else entirely at full height. She handed him a blade without comment. He took it in the same way, without comment, but his fingers closed around the handle, with a familiarity that told her everything she needed to know about the man behind the title. They stood together at the interior wall, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Outside, she could hear the pack repositioning, the soft compression of footsteps in snow, disciplined and wide-ranging, spreading out around the cabin's perimeter with a precision that transformed the structure from a building into something else. A fortified point, a thing with teeth. "You're not what I expected," Nathan said quietly. "You expected an Omega," Karen said. "I expected someone frightened. I'm frightened." She checked the crossbow drawer one final time and found it solid. "I'm also better at this than they'll be expecting." "Those aren't the same thing." She heard it then, felt it, almost, in the same way she had felt the vibration of the wolves beneath the lake ice, a presence at the tree line, crossing into the open ground, then another. The specific quality of outdoor silence that meant it had been interrupted by something moving through it with intent. Nathan had gone completely still beside her. "East side," he said, very low. 4. West side, 3. She had not heard that. She did not ask how he had. Front approach. At least 2 more. He looked at her. She looked at him. The amber eyes in the dim cabin light were precise and calm and carried. Beneath that, something she recognized from her own reflection in the winter window on the worst mornings of the last 3 years. The decision to not be afraid of what was coming. Just the decision. Held steady, like a rope pulled taut. Karen raised the crossbow. "Stay on my left," she said. "Your shoulder won't take a full swing on the right." He did not answer, but he moved left. Outside, the snow compacted under weight. Deliberate, close, unmistakable. 1 boot, then another. The hunters had reached the porch. The first trap triggered 12 seconds after the boots hit the porch. Karen heard the snap of the spring, and then a sound she had no interest in examining too closely, followed by the heavy collapse of a body in the snow on the east side of the cabin. She was already at the window, crossbow leveled, the bolt tracking the second shape crossing the open ground at a run. She exhaled and fired. The man dropped before he reached the porch rail. She was reloading before he landed. The door did not hold long. She had not expected it to, and had not wasted time trying to reinforce it. When it came inward, it came hard. 2 hunters with axes, using the momentum of their run. They entered fast, and found Rail, the vanguard's largest man, already in the space behind the door. What happened next was brief and decisive, and left both hunters on the floor. Outside, the battle had become noise. Karen processed it in pieces the way her father had taught her. Not the whole picture, which was too large and too fast to manage, but specific points of information delivered by sound and movement. Boots on the north wall. 2 men, moving toward the back window. The crack of a bear trap on the west side, then a shout that cut short. The low, percussive sound of bodies, in contact with bodies. The particular rhythm of men who were trained fighting men, who were something beyond training. Nathan moved through the cabin like weather. She had been watching him sideways for 6 chapters of her own fear, telling her to focus elsewhere, and she understood now why the vanguard deferred to him without signal or sound. He was not faster than his warriors. He was more economical, the way a river is more economical than rain. All of it moving in one direction, with a force that did not advertise itself. He put a hunter down with 1 strike, stepped over him without looking, and was at the back window before the glass had finished falling. "Northeast corner," he said. "They're bringing fire." Karen crossed the room, looked out. He was right. A man at the tree line was raising a pitch torch, angling it toward the cabin roof. She leveled the crossbow, accounted for the distance and the cold's effect on the bolt's arc, and fired. The torch went into the snow. She heard Nathan make a sound beside her. Low, almost involuntary. She did not look at him. She reloaded. The second wave was smaller and faster. 4 hunters who had held back from the first push, and timed their entry for the moment the vanguard was most distributed. They came through the east wall. Not the door, not the window. Through the planks themselves, which told Karen they had done this before, and against things that were difficult to kill. They were using silver-tipped short blades, and moving with the coordinated silence of professionals. One of them saw her. He changed direction in the same step, because she was the smallest thing in the room, and therefore, to his experience, the safest target. Karen had been told her whole life that being underestimated was a wound. Her father had told her it was a gift. She let him close half the distance before she put the crossbow bolt through his shoulder, at a range that required no arc calculation whatsoever. He went down hard and did not get up. The other 3 lasted approximately 40 seconds against Rail, and 2 of the vanguard who had come back, inside from the perimeter, which was enough time for Karen to reload and hold the window line against another approach from the trees. Then quiet came. Sudden. Total. The specific quiet of a space where movement has stopped. Karen stayed at the window. She could feel her pulse in her palms, and the specific soreness of muscles that had been pulling wolf-sized objects out of freezing water the night before. And she breathed through all of it, and kept her eyes on the tree line. The shadows were retreating. She tracked them until she couldn't. "They're falling back," Nathan said from the center of the room. She lowered the crossbow 2 inches. Not all the way. The vanguard had moved to the perimeter without instruction, resetting their positions, checking the corners. Rael was at the door. Every man was bloodied and still standing, which Karen noted as the defining characteristic of the vanguard that she would not forget. She was about to turn from the window. A sound came from the back wall. Not the door, not the window. A deep, splintering impact from below the sill line. The sound of something heavy, driven with intention into old timber. Then the wall came in. He was large, the last hunter, and he came through the planks in a cascade of snow and broken wood, with a silver blade in each hand, and his eyes already fixed on her. Not Nathan, not the vanguard. Her. She did not have time to raise the crossbow. The hunter crossed the cabin in 3 steps, and Karen had just enough instinct left to drop sideways off the window ledge before the first blade came through the space her head had occupied. She hit the floor hard, rolled, came up against the far wall with nothing in her hands that would stop Silver, and the hunter already turning to follow. She looked at those blades and understood, with complete clarity, that she had run out of options. Nathan hit him from the side like a collapsed wall. It was not a fighting technique she had a name for. It was the application of mass and intention at a velocity that did not leave room for response. The hunter was there, and then he was not, and the cabin shook with the impact of his body meeting the floor. Nathan had him by the collar before the second bounce. 1 arm, no blade. He crossed the room in 2 steps and put the man through the remains of the wall he had made coming in, out into the snow, where he landed and did not rise. The silence that followed was absolute. Nathan stood in the gap in the wall with his back to her, and for a moment neither of them moved. The wind came through the opening and moved the candle flames sideways. Outside, somewhere in the tree line, she heard the sound of men moving fast away from the cabin, the specific retreat of people who have recalculated and found the number wrong. Then she heard nothing. Karen became aware that she was sitting on the cabin floor with her back against the wall and her empty crossbow in her lap. She became aware that her left arm was bleeding from a place she did not remember being cut. She became aware that her hands were shaking, not from cold this time, not from exertion, but from the specific aftermath of having been, for approximately 4 seconds, out of solutions. She had not been frightened during the battle. She was frightened now, which meant it was over, which was how her father had explained that particular sequence to her a long time ago. You don't get scared while it's happening, he had said. You get scared after. That's how you know you're still in one piece. Nathan turned from the gap in the wall. He crossed the room without hurry, and she tracked him because there was nothing else she was capable of at the moment, and he crouched in front of her at a distance that was careful and deliberate, and stopped there. He looked at her arm first, then at her face. Then, for a long moment, at some middle point that she understood was not a failure to focus, but the opposite of one. You held the window line through a 2-wave assault, he said, with a bolt-load crossbow and your father's traps. The traps did most of it. You set the traps. She did not answer. He moved, slowly, to sit beside her against the wall, which brought him close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, that same impossible warmth she had found in the freezing water of the Blackmere, the first impossible thing she had noticed and set aside to think about later. Later had apparently arrived. The vanguard gave them space. She was aware of them in her periphery, the quiet repositioning of large men who understood something she did not yet, creating a circle of their absence around the 2 of them. Rael stood at the repaired door with his back to the room. None of them looked. Karen. She looked at him. What she found on his face was not an expression she had seen there before. The authority was still present. She suspected it was structural, bone deep, a thing he had been born carrying and would die with. But behind it, or perhaps through it, something else had come forward, something that had not been calculated or decided or performed. He moved. Nathan, Alpha King of the Northern Wilds, lowered himself from the wall to one knee on the cabin floor in front of her, and the vanguard behind him did not move or speak, and the wind came through the broken wall, and the candles burned sideways, and the moment had a quality of weight that Karen felt in her sternum. "You pulled me out of the dark," he said. "You cut the silver from my shoulder. You armed your house and held the line and did not break." A pause. "I have known warriors for 30 years. I know what that is." Karen's throat had closed. She did not trust it with words. "Come to the winter court," Nathan said. "Stand beside me. Whatever you are willing to give, your knowledge, your counsel, your presence, I will meet it. Fully, equally." His amber eyes held hers without pressure, without demand, with the particular restraint of a man offering something he understood the weight of. "I am not asking you to belong to my world, Karen. I am asking whether you will let me show it to you." She thought about the frozen lake, the rope, the dark water, and the heartbeat she had stayed awake to protect. She thought about her father's cabin, and the 3 winters she had survived alone in it, and the specific quality of a life built entirely from refusal to break. She thought about the amber eyes she had found at the bottom of the Black Mere. "Show me," she said. The words "show me" stayed in the air longer than words usually last. Karen became aware, gradually, of the quality of the silence surrounding them. Not empty silence, but full silence. The kind a room of people creates when they have all decided, without discussion, not to speak. She looked past Nathan's shoulder at the vanguard, at Rael at the door, at the others positioned through her small cabin, these enormous scarred men who had stood beside her in the dark and taken silver wounds without breaking. They were looking at her, not the way they had looked at her on the first morning, when she had come up from sleep to find them arranged through her space like an impossible fact. That had been assessment. What she saw on their faces now was something older and more specific, a quality she had no experience receiving, and therefore almost did not recognize. Rael brought his fist to his chest, one deliberate, unhurried motion. Then the man beside him did the same, then the next, and the next, moving around the room in sequence until all 10 of them stood with their right hands pressed flat to their hearts, their eyes on her, their expressions carrying a gravity that required no translation. They were not saluting Nathan. Karen's throat did something she did not give it permission to do. She pressed her lips together and looked at the floor until she had collected herself, because she was not going to come apart in front of 11 werewolves in her own cabin. Some standards had to be maintained regardless of circumstances. Nathan waited. He was very good at waiting. She thought about the lake. Not the battle, not the rescue. The moment before all of it, when she had been carrying firewood through the snow, and the world had been exactly the size it always was. One cabin, one ridge, one woman surviving a life that had been handed back to her, emptied out. She had not been unhappy. Exactly. Unhappiness required the expectation of something better, and Karen had stopped expecting things a long time ago. She thought about her father, what he would have said. He had been a man who expressed approval through the specific quality of his silence. She knew how to read it. The silence he would have offered her right now would have been warm. "The winter court," she said. "How far?" 3 days north on foot. 1 day with horses." Nathan had risen from his knee without her registering it, and stood now at his full height, the bandaged shoulder held careful and still. Rael cached them 2 miles east, before the ambush. "You came prepared for survival. Always." Karen stood. She was stiff in too many places to count, and the cut on her arm had dried to a thin crust that pulled when she moved, and she was wearing the same clothes she had put on yesterday morning, before her life had changed its shape. She looked around the cabin. The fire burned down to orange coals, the broken wall, the overturned chair, the cot where a dying wolf had become a king between one night and the next. She crossed to the window. Outside, the world was white and absolute. The storm had left the frost veil clean, the particular clean that existed only a few hours after heavy snowfall, before the wind and the animals came back and complicated it. The pines along the ridge stood dark against a sky that had finally decided to let some light through. The Black Mere glittered at the edge of her vision, frozen and still and innocent-looking, as if it had not tried to swallow 11 lives less than a day ago. 3 years she had stood at this window. She had a sudden, complete understanding that she would not stand here again. She picked up her father's hunting knife and put it on her belt. She took the remaining bolts from the floor and pocketed them. She crossed to the compartment behind the false wall and lifted out the cloth bundle of her father's border notes. His knowledge of this land was worth more than anything else in the cabin, and she was not leaving it behind. She turned to the room. "I'm ready," she said. They walked out into the snow together, and the winter court was 3 days north, and the frost veil lay open and white under a sky that had stopped fighting the light. Nathan moved to her left. She noted, without comment, that it was her strong side, the side with the crossbow, the uninjured arm, the clean sightline. She did not know if he had calculated it or simply felt it. She suspected, with Nathan, those were rarely different things. The vanguard spread wide around them through the trees, silent and vast, moving the way they had moved, escorting her through the storm the night before. Like a shield that had chosen her. Karen looked north. She had gone to the lake to save 10 wolves. She had pulled a king out of the dark without knowing what he was. And somewhere between the freezing water and the broken wall and the long night held between them, she had become something she had no name for yet. She found, to her own quiet surprise, that she was not afraid of that. She was looking forward to finding out. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.